Welcome to Reel Filmmaking. My name's Corey, and today I'm going to be sharing with you the settings that I use on my Canon M50 for video production. Now, I've done a couple videos here on the channel about the Canon M50 and about the kit lens that comes with it, and honestly, I think this camera is awesome for the price and the quality of video that you can get out of this thing. It's hard to beat it. So I'm gonna show you the settings that I use when I go out to shoot B-roll or even just talking head stuff in the studio like this. Hopefully my settings can help you dial in exactly what you're trying to do, or if you're just new to the Canon M50, these are settings that you can just plug into your camera and you can get out there and start shooting. And that's always my goal. I wanna help you get out there and start making movies because that's the best way we learn and grow as filmmakers. So without further ado, let's get into it. When you first turn on your Canon M50 and you hit the menu button, you'll probably see something like this. It's a white menu, and the M50 comes set up with a guided menu. We're not gonna wanna use that, so you're gonna wanna go all the way over to the right, hit OK, and here hit menu display and change it from guided to standard. That will give you the more standard looking Canon DSLR menu that we're going to be using, and that allows us to access a lot more of the specific features that you can't use in the guided mode. So once we've done that, let's go all the way over to the right, Canon M50. And this is where we're going to do a majority of our changes. So right here in shooting mode, you're going to want to hit the Q button, or also for all of these things, the Canon M50 has a touch screen, so you can do that too. But we're going to want to go from movie auto mode to manual movie exposure. This is going to allow us to change things like exposure and shutter speed, control those ourselves. Now, we're going to go movie record quality. There's a lot of different options that the Canon M50 can shoot in: 4K, 1080 60, 1080 30, 1080 24. For these purposes and for a lot of beginners starting with video, and if you're wanting to make movies, you're gonna go with 24 frames per second. That's right here, 1920 by 1080p. So we'll click that. Next, you're gonna wanna go sound recording. If you are using an external sound recorder like a shotgun mic that you put on top of your M50, you want to go here and hit manual, and that will allow you to get full control over that. I generally tend to leave the recording level a little less than half in between the second box here. You can mess with different things to test what works best for your microphone. Going down this menu, lens aberration correction, don't worry about that. Remote control, leave disabled. Time-lapse movie mode, there's great features in the Canon M50. Let's leave that disabled for right now. We go over to the next page, exposure compensation, that is grayed out, just don't worry about that right now. Auto lighting optimizer, I tend to leave that off when I'm shooting video. If there's anything I want to correct lighting wise, I do that in my editing software. Highlight tone priority, the same thing, I leave that off. Metering timer, leave that, the default is 8 seconds. So for the white balance, the Canon M50 has a couple presets that you can go through. When I'm just trying to run and gun, auto white balance tends to do a really good job. If I'm in a controlled space like a studio, I might set the white balance myself. Some of these presets are actually really good. So if I'm outside, I'll usually just hop over to the daylight preset, or if it's cloudy, and the camera does a really good job of figuring out the white balance. Then there's different features of how to do things with touch and drag autofocus. So the touch and drag AF, I enable that because that's really good. That's going to allow you to touch on the screen, and whatever you touch, the camera will go to pull in focus. So for example, if I put my hand here and I touch the screen, it's going to pull that into focus. So that's a super handy feature of the Canon M50. For the autofocus method, I leave it on face tracking. It's going to use a dual pixel autofocus to detect if there are moving subjects through the frame, particularly people. If you know you're not going to be shooting people, there's a couple other options. You can do zone AF or 1-point AF, but I tend to leave it on the face tracking, which is, I think, the best. Movie servo AF, you want to enable that so you can have the face tracking, and then focus mode, you want to leave it on autofocus. Lens electronic MF, we'll just leave that off. Manual focus peaking settings, this is to give you focus peaking on the camera, so when you're using manual focus, it will show whatever is in focus. It will show outlines of color around that. So I leave that on if I'm shooting manually. You can choose how much you want it. You can choose what color. I tend to think red shows up the best. IS settings, the Canon M50 has something called digital IS, and so if you're shooting moving subjects or if you're vlogging with the camera, you can enable that. And then this right here, the button function, you can choose what you want the shutter button to do. So I have mine actually here. Half press will help me to get metering and autofocus, but I changed this to fully press, so that way I can press right here on the shutter button all the way down and it starts and stops movie recording, because the default start stop movie button is really small. It's like right here and it can be really easy to miss, and it's hard to tell sometimes if you hit it. So I leave fully press on start stop movie recording. So now that we've talked about all that other stuff, I wanted to come back to picture style, because this is something, as I've shot with the M50, is something that I found of a personal preference that I like to set to get the best looking images for me out of this camera. So when you click picture style, you'll see that the Canon M50 is loaded with lots of different picture styles you can choose from auto to standard. And basically what these picture profiles do are they are changing how the camera is processing things like colors, shadows, highlights, the amount of contrast it's adding before it gets that footage recorded in camera. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to go and click neutral. And so if you click this and if you hit the info button, you can actually alter some of these. So I've taken a neutral picture profile, and what I do, I take the strength of the sharpness, I turn it down to 2. I take the contrast and I pull it all the way down to 0. I take the saturation and leave it straight at 0, and I leave the color tone at 0. You may have heard of the Canon color science, and people say that because Canon does a really good job of recreating colors naturally, specifically skin tones. So by leaving the saturation and the color tone at 0, I'm still retaining that information. I want the camera to process colors like that. But by turning down the contrast and the sharpness, I am allowing the camera to even out a little bit more how it deals with highlights and shadows. And pulling the sharpness down, it's not doing as much in-camera digital sharpening. If I want to adjust things like with the highlights and the shadows and sharpening up my image, I can do that in post in my editing software where I can have a little bit more control. So I hope you found these settings helpful, that you can get plugged into your Canon M50 so you can just get out there and start making movies. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to Reel Filmmaking for more content about cameras, creative process, and filmmaking coming on a weekly basis. And until next time, keep making movies and watching movies, and I'll see you on Reel Filmmaking.